Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Korean warfare. In a single video you can't make the entire military history of a millennium, even for a single region. The purpose, however, is to provide with an important basis for further videos, and anyone who just wants to have a compass, right, for medieval Korean warfare. That we mostly discuss in function of the Chinese one, or at least of the major power, of course, in the broader area. That is also the one that often documents these other populations around, about which we do not have tremendous details, as we will find out for Korea as well, and as we've seen, sadly enough, also for other countries. Of course, again, there is actually a lot of stuff out there I could dig, and I would dig further in the future, especially if you're interested. However, in this case, and I take a look at that naturally for the visual side of the story, there is an interesting set of iconographic evidence that instead was not present for other regions, and that tells a lot also against, for example, certain Chinese narratives that wanted to depict the Koreans a bit as the savages of the situation, and in many ways they kind of were compared to Chinese civilization, but to the point they altered even some objective realities, such as, for example, the presence of a heavy cavalry in the Korean armies that is beautifully documented, even in a heavier fashion than the Chinese one, with the splendid cataphracts, for example. But more of this later, right? There's no doubt that the Chinese always had a colonial interest in Korea, and this is still true today. Nothing can happen really between the North and the South without Beijing saying its own. And this state of affairs lasts since 346 BC, right? This is the moment in which China first establishes the dominance over Korea, obviously in a decentralized way with significant difficulties, as we will see throughout the millennium, just to maintain a direct control. And the Koreans always maintaining a strong national spirit on their own, right? In Chinese history, you look at this essentially occupation and wars with the Koreans that by the imperial sources are described as sort of mopping up operations of some sort, police actions or whatever. And actually there is a lot of evidence from the Chinese side of the story, but it's always sort of belittling, in fact, the Korean military capacities that were instead important, relevant, of course. And there was a general subservience, however, of the peninsula to China. Obviously enough, the latter was the strongest power, and there was a clientery subjection of some sort for which Koreans were to send military contingents to back the imperial forces. We're talking mostly about infantry. Surely from a numerical point of view, these were the bulk of the Korean army sent by the Chinese to fight the Xiongnu, for example. These are documented, which, as you understand, in that circumstance, like being brought like from the other side of China, fighting these nomadic warriors just by imposition, would not produce a very high valor motivation among Korean troops. Now we will explain also what's the deal here. I talk about infantry because anecdotally they are registered, but there is all an evolution of Korean warfare that always, of course, entailed cavalry and infantry, as basically all these peoples. It was naturally a sedentary country at large, and infantry for of course, a polity that was fundamentally subjected to greater overlords was what was given by the local aristocracies that trying to preserve themselves, and that albeit co-opted to some degree, were not fostered particularly by the Chinese, because it would have equated to some sort of strengthening of the local political basis. The problems with the Chinese control of Korea for other peripheral areas of the empire began essentially during the migration era. We're talking from the 4th, the 6th century. I made a video about the Han's armies organization. We will talk also about the following centuries Chinese military. In any case, during this period, the Koreans began to rise consistently into a total war by the 7th century over the Chinese dominance on the peninsula. The Chinese sources say that the Korean army assembled against the imperial forces at Anshi-Cheng was composed of over 200,000 men, which naturally doesn't make any sense. An army at the time would have not been larger than 50,000 men, which would have been already like a miracle just to field, to command, also in battle and whatever. In any case, these numbers stand, as we've seen also in other videos about Chinese warfare, that really, stem from the way these peoples were used to picture the world and say quantities and their connection with the deity. So they were obviously wrong. There was not a conspiracy theory against 21st century paranoid people that think that historians are putting up this altar to damage them in some reason. This is the fruit of their own way of seeing things that could be biased, but not in the sense that the quantities here are just random or randomly large. Right? It simply meant a big army of regional scale, and this rebellion was quelled by the great commander Li Shih-min, that is the Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. This battle is fascinating because surely the Chinese downplay also their forces, at least in parallel to this, a larger Korean army, again 200 in this case, 150,000 specifically against the Tang one of 30,000. It's a battle in which terrain also plays an important role to hide forces for carrying out an encircling maneuver that recalls actually the Carthaginian tactic at the Battle of Cannae. So this battle was fought between the Tang dynasty and what were called the Goguryeo forces. That stands essentially for from Korea, right? And on June the 23rd, 644, it was a major strategic event that unfolded with intricate tactical maneuvers. The Korean cavalry, under the leadership of generals Go Yeon-su and Go Yen-jin, charged towards the Chinese infantry that was drawn up in apparently like a shield wall formation, so at least a thickly packed one. I always remember that the shield, though this is described at least in the historiography like that, I honestly am not aware of the original term because it's a mess just even to transliterate, to transcribe, and so on, and to interpret it, by the way, as well. But always remember that shield wall formation has nothing to do with a shield per se, right? You put shields just in front of yourself to cover yourself from projectiles, but you still fight with lances, with swords, with whatever you're handling as a heavy infantry. And the Koreans essentially believed to have the upper hand to the seemingly smaller size and thinly held lines of the Chinese army. However, little did they know that this was all part of Emperor Taizong's plan to lure them into a trap. Again, the terrain was quite complex. The Korean left in rear were sheltered by some mountains, so that the Chinese could move and arrange their troops in a way that temporarily the Koreans wouldn't realize we're there. So there is an initial cavalry charge by the Korean forces that eventually used, as we will see better later, a consistent actual amount of heavy cavalry that was met with mass projectile shots from the tank archers. We're talking also crossbowmen, specifically catapults, but the momentum of the charge caused significant casualties among the Chinese, as the cavalry did manage to break through their lines. This witnessing that, of course, it was still part of a trap, but the Chinese, of course, weren't just sending those men temporarily to be slaughtered to make the plan carried out. They will try to bog down the enemy cavalry charge. That was not enough. They managed to break through. But despite this early success for the Koreans, they soon realized that they had fallen into a well-orchestrated trap. As they pressed on with their assault, the Chinese army revealed its true strength behind, with infantry coming from, emerging from behind the shield wall, led by the Emperor Taizong himself. This much denser, numerous formation. The Emperor Taizong's decisive moment came, however, when he ordered the sounding of drums and horns to signal a flanking attack by a cavalry detachment led by Zhang Sun Wuji that was hidden in a hill north of Mount Jupil with 10,000 men, or 11,000 actually. The sudden encirclement of the Koreans from behind mirrored this famous tactic used by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae, inasmuch as the initial tank forces had met with the Korean onslaught had began to actually curve into a U shape, right, to sort of bottle up the enemy, and so gradually giving ground but still maintaining control of the troops. Again, that's just like what Hannibal made the Celts doing, and this requires an enormous control of the troops, right? Which is also a gamble just per se, because you can't make, especially in this context where, as we will see, there is much more shock force involved. I mean, at Cannae, you had essentially infantry versus infantry. Doesn't matter how deep and sort of pugnacious the Roman legionaries were. Here we're talking about shock cavalry charges by in fact, heavily armored and properly cataphracted horsemen. So it's much even more of a gamble. But again, Taizong's explorer, famous. We will talk about him at some other point for sure. And this Chinese tactic led essentially to a one-sided slaughter, as the tanks tightened the noose around their enemies. And realizing the gravity of their situation, the two Korean generals attempted to rally their men and retreat to join the main body of their army across the river to the south. However, their escape route was cut off by the destruction of the bridges by the Chinese, leaving them stranded atop Mount Jupil. And the tanks pursued relentlessly, eventually encircling the remaining Koreans on the mountain. Meanwhile, the main body of the Korean army attempted to come to the rescue of their comrades on Mount Jupil, but found themselves surrounded themselves and counterattacked on three sides by the Chinese. And so, despite their efforts, the Koreans failed to reach their trapped friends and were forced to retreat, dispersing in the face of overwhelming Chinese forces. As the tank army chased down the fleeing Koreans, they captured a significant number of soldiers and valuable resources, including horses, cows, and metal body armor, which is something that, as we will see now, sort of contradicts to some extent the alleged lack of heavies, even when it comes to cavalry, independently from what the Chinese in other sources would say, the aftermath of the battle, by the way, the surrender of the two Korean generals, while the rest of their forces faced either death or capture at the hands of the relentless Chinese pursuit. Allegedly, there were 20,000 Korean dead and 36,000 prisoners. This early medieval battle is a testament to the Chinese advancement in the art of war, its superiority aside from the great command overall on Korean warfare in general, but we see the latter also capable of especially great inland cavalry charges and a capacity to resist even under in dire strait, let's say. This goes on because, of course, these are always the weaker powers when it comes to whoever is ruling in China. And they get, in fact, dominated in the following centuries by the Liao, the Khitans. Made a video about their warfare, their dominance essentially on the northern half of the Korean peninsula from the 10th to the 12th century. This injects a bit more of sort of steppish influence in Korea that already had received actually an important one autonomously. Then we see, and through China, I mean, just historically. Then you have the Yurkens that rule up to the first half of the 13th century, specifically 1232, when the ruler was forced to flee to the island of Kangba, and the Koreans were left basically alone fighting against the Mongols, putting up even a strong resistance. Of course, the Mongols prevailed, but as we will see now, the resistance of the Koreans in certain cases was really clamorous. After all these centuries, after all, the Goryeo dynasty was at the head of Korea, and the Mongols had to launch a series of campaigns, in fact between 1231 and 1270, to have to get the upper hand in a more or less stable way. And these were specifically 7 major expeditions that came at tremendous cost to Korean life overall, especially civilian one. The Mongols terrorizing the country exactly to break the spirit of the people. The last campaign finally made most of the country a vassal state of the Yuan dynasty, which would last for essentially almost a century, 80 years or so. However, there were important rebellion movements existing throughout this time, and 1274, some Korean territory succeeded in holding out, existing outside of Mongol control. There were tributes that the Koreans had to pay properly through their monarchs to the Yuan dynasty. Definitely Korea was not better off under the Mongols than the previous Chinese, and as you know, there was a big deal of continuity in that regard. Essentially, the country kept working in its traditional function of recruitment pool of warm bodies for the Chinese Empire. As we will see now, more than 21,000 Koreans would serve in the Mongolian armies as auxiliaries, right? And bitterly enough, a very few of these troops came back, right? This is especially the case, considering that these souls were the ones employed against the ill-fated and mismanaged Mongolian invasions of Japan. The most important Korean rebellion against the rule of the Yuans was the one of Sambaeolcho. The Koreans, together with the Song dynasty, put up against the Mongol invasion, what was defined in the Chinese sources as a stubborn resistance, unlike many others of those that in Eurasia had been taken over by the Mongols, and often in a very quick way. Right, there is an episode that is the siege of Kuyu, occurred in 1231, right, constituting a remarkable Korean victory against the Mongols that were quite skilled at that point, also through Chinese influence in polyurcetics, and that failed instead against the city, right. The Mongols had crossed the Yalu River. They had been capturing quite quickly basically all of Korean border defenses. However, they met this stiff resistance both at Anyu and the city of Kuyu, that is today's Kusong, commanded in this instance by the General Park Seo. And what is interesting is how much not just the Mongols display in terms of siege capability, but how much counter siege technology and actual doctrine the Koreans do at this point. There were lines of catapults launching both boulders and molten metals at the city walls. There were special assault teams manning the siege towers and scaling ladders from the Mongol side. The Mongols attempted to throw flaming carts against the city wooden gates. They also dug tunnels under the Korean walls. There were also these fire bombs that naturally, in context where most buildings were made of flammable material within the city walls, could be quite effective. These were grisly weapons containing boiled down, liquefied human fat, which means that they literally used the enemy corpses to fabricate them. But the Koreans were also very well equipped, as we were saying, using especially a type of weapon that was used extensively by the Chinese. Again, here there is nothing peculiar or special aside from the capacity of employment and the effectiveness of it, bringing together naturally with all the other things, moral force primarily, as we know as Clausewitzians, to the Korean victory against this major Mongolian onslaught, right? We're talking about traction trebuchet. Essentially, it's a lever catapult that you activate by pulling on the ropes by muscular force, by the actual crew. The Koreans would use stones, clay pots holding molten iron, and incendiary devices, also produced with human fat equally to their enemies naturally. And so we have to think about a constant bombardment. And the interesting thing is that this trebuchet were activated from within the city walls, so shooting blindly as far as the crew was concerned above the same or over the Mongols in front of the city walls, directed by some officers that were on the city walls, and so would essentially adjust the shot based on they would start throwing highly, and then they would adjust the force right accordingly. The interesting thing is that these trebuchets were also mobile. They had 4 wheels at a time. There were different types, but the capacity of throwing these molten iron bombs against the Mongol men and siege machinery was quite effective. The trebuchet had a fulcrum in this rotating pivot at the top of a single pole, and it allowed this very quick aim with some important precision as well. It was about pulling down this ropes. Then there would be a major cushion formed by a pad of coiled ropes when the arm struck the upright. The Korean resistance was atrocious, and according to an elderly Mongol commander who recalled that episode towards the end of his life, speaking of the final phases of the same siege, quote, "I have never seen a city undergo an attack like this, which did not in the end submit." This was a Mongol general, right, of the early, say, of the 13th century, that had witnessed how many fortresses stormed, its inhabitants massacred, etc. Say he was not easily impressed, right? The Mongols were not provided with any particular trace of human sensitivity, and these are the things that stood out, right? That stuck in their minds. The fact that albeit the Koreans were heavily outnumbered, they remained under the Mongol siege for 30 days, right? So for a long time, which the Mongols threw the hell against them, they still refused to surrender, and the Mongol casualties were piling up all around the city walls, so that the besiegers at a point had better to do. They were losing too much, and they decided to pull out of the siege and withdraw, right? And the city resisted in that regard. Again, Korea as a whole was taken over, but as we were saying before, there were some fortresses that held out, right? And that's the testament to a specific spirit, right, of this people. So if we were to sum up a bit like the organization of Korean armies during the Middle Ages, we would have some embarrassment for the early times. Actually, we can't start from the very origins of Korea, because I'm not going to make another video about ancient Korean warfare. I mean, if it is something quite specific, yes, but we do not know too much, and so we can wrap it up perhaps just in this one, and then at some point I can just dive into it a bit more in detail. But really, we know very few explicitly. Archaeologically, we know something more, of course, but here we talk the army organization. We know in this quasi-mythical past, in 997 BC, the chronology is also debatable, as you understand, Chun, the son of Kiyao, the immortal, right, semi-legendary figure, in fact, and founder of the Jia Joseon of ancient Korea, essentially a member of the Shang dynasty royal house that was installed there, had an army of 7,300 men, subdivided into 59 regiments, we could say, of about, we're told, 123, 124 men each. That is around, again, 7,300 men in total, right? This sound like companies of some sort, rather than regiments, and they do make sense to some extent. This is a bit like, I don't know, maniples, right, of the Roman army, but it's just, very far-fetched as a comparison. But remember that there is, of course, in all armies some sort of universal, fundamental, in terms of like how humans count and organize themselves and fight in groups, that does find correspondence. We've seen it also, for example, in the Han army with the contemporary Roman military. Then we go pretty fast forward in time to find another information finally. In 346 BC, the Korean army is described as counting 1,000 cavalry and 10,000 infantry. Right, we do not know about the subunits. However, the decimal system makes sense, because as we will see now, cavalry was already there, and of course, and quite important. The proportions involved here speak of a substantially stronger aristocracy, but still a relevant participation of the local levies, there is some surface of tribalism still in the air, right? So the idea that the people still has an important power over a gradually structuring aristocracy should be reflected by this cavalry-infantry ratio. Then we jump forward again with a huge step, and we find ourselves period of the Battle of Xi-Cheng that we discussed before. So it does seem numerically that infantry was the main arm. However, it seems that cataphracts that we will illustrate now iconographically, if you find a cataphract in the pictures, especially if it's a fresco, the yellowish one, that's the one from this era. And so definitely a quite bulky type of cavalry here, stemming from the broader Eurasian and especially steppes warfare, speaks of an important feudalization. So surely by this point, also again, the Far East had exhausted itself during the migration era. The peasantry had gone down, the elites had strengthened. We see also a segmentation within the same cavalry, especially horse archers, light cavalry of some sort that naturally was following these heavier cataphracts. Again, it's a very steppe-like warfare. If you consider that the equestrian culture of that, it obviously stems from an influence. Again, the Koreans are not nomadic or semi-nomadic people, but the influence from the steppe is so strong, right? The same Chinese, as you know, have copied essentially the Central Asian heavy cavalry. They imported the heavenly horses to China. We talk about them extensively, and here the Koreans have absorbed that to an important degree, and they're fighting against the Chinese as well that do have that still. But it does seem, as we will see better later, that by this point the Koreans had been developing, perhaps because of their greater feudal character, a bit more aristocratic, private, encapsulated and sort of out there, one of the Chinese, even in fact, let's say, as far as the individual horseman is concerned, even a heavier type of cataphract than the Chinese one. At least the Koreans would be often well equipped as far as that was concerned. It's just, again, an elite. It's the top of the top. This is something you see also among the nomads, right? Nomadic warfare is inferior to the one of the sedentary world, but the elite is ultra elite, right? So the Chinese were, in spite of the collapse of their empire, still trying to live off the broader, civilizational combined arms, larger levies, sort of greater management of larger armored forces of some sort, in spite of the very deep intertwinement. We will talk more about early medieval Chinese warfare. I made a video about, for example, the Tibetans, and in that southwestern frontier of China you see a very interesting hybrid, also with the Turkic influences at this point and more. Then overall, our best information about medieval Korean armies comes from, as for many people, from the broader area, from Eastern Eurasia. During the Mongol invasions, this does not render us the entirety of the Korean army organization, but we have some unit and rank names, unit sizes, and so we can draw some conclusion from this still essentially fragmentary evidence. We know of the Chinju rank, essentially the army commander, the army naturally varying in size, unless this was some sort of provincial force that could be fielded in comparable numbers across the other Korean ones, but this is not said. We rather have a regimental force of 1,000 men, this unit was commanded by an officer known as Tor-yong, and there was a similar cavalry unit, evidently a sort of a cavalry regiment led by a Sing-gyong. This suggests, of course, an important role of the mounted arm, which is definitely confirmed. We'll see. We'll sort of summarize at the end more or less what was the fluctuation of the cavalry infantry forces in Korean warfare later. Let's finish this for now. We know of other unit sizes of still 1,150, so nothing really strange. These are basically companies with some platoons, if you want, and contained making up regiments, right? You had a guard unit known as Tobang, 500 men each apparently. Then a cavalry unit of 1,000 known as Singji. That would be the same one that we were quoting before. Actually, yes, we do know they were 1,000 horsemen explicitly, so this definitely confirms the fact that cavalry was particularly more important than infantry at this point. It is a bit like the peak of feudalism also as far as Korea was concerned, right? So we definitely see the infantry heavily subordinated to cavalry, even more than in Europe at this point, that had much stronger communal infantries, right, that were also present in more, in greater numerical proportion, and were also surely better equipped. We find a similarly sized unit of crossbowmen, however, as well, known as Taegak, and this makes a lot of sense because, generally speaking, whenever you find let's say, this is my experience in sanitary warfare for medieval times, whenever there is a cavalry preponderance and a sort of infantry scarcity, however, the missile element is very much more present next to the horsemen than the actual heavy infantry, right? Because that's what they needed, right? You need heavy infantry, hopefully, ideally, to stop cavalry, but at this time in history, this is here evidently not the case. Cavalry was decisive, especially in these regions. This was true for Europe as well during the 13th century, so there is, without exceptions, right? So at least we're talking about the broader, more advanced Western warfare in general. But when cavalry dominates, this is essentially an auxiliary force of sorts. So either you station them on the wings and you try to outflank the enemy, cavalry, by essentially overwhelming your infantry counterpart on front of yourself on the wing, or you do not really have that because infantry is not really strong. These are just a bunch of peasants that are better off in terms of combat quality just working the land at home as labor rather in fact than labor force than manpower. And you'll have instead these crossbowmen that are light infantry. They're relatively cheap, not too much, especially if they are really complementary to your cavalry units, and their purpose is in fact striking against cavalry, which even if it's not going to be decisive, because if heavy infantry is not light can be, but still they're flexible, they're mobile, and horses especially suffer a lot of crossbow bolts. This is pretty much everywhere from Europe to China, and so it's not surprising here to find such organized units of crossbowmen, almost, if I understand well here, essentially pairing the infantry and cavalry ones, right? Regiments of 1,000, even though the term regiment for crossbowmen is a bit excessive, perhaps, because at least they have a different drill, different training. They're operating essentially in loose, open formation. We know of this proportion during the same period that is 3 100 men units out of every 1000 men unit were considered shock or elite. So if I understand this correctly, it means that within say a regular force of whichever, here it can be horsemen, infantrymen, 1/3 is considered heavier, right? It could be not differently actually from, could be the same Europe and China, like actually 1/3 of, or slightly less of, actually heavily armored troops that are considered like the front line, and then the rest is softer. This is kind of the case for all units basically in history when it comes to, especially to the heavies here. Of course, here we're not talking, I don't think, well, it could have encompassed some elite forces, maybe even among the crossbowmen. Maybe some of course were better armored, whatever, so it could be even for that. But here we're talking mostly about what went into hand-to-hand combat, right? And so what had to hold the line in the front, and in this segmentation, within functional segmentation within the unit, how it was designed. This makes, again, sense. It's not a strange proportion. We see pretty heavy cavalry around, by the way. We will talk more about the cataphracts as a single unit type later in their equipment, what their armor is represented like, etc. So those were surely elite heavy cavalry units. They may have constituted bodyguards, but of course there was some sort of regimental heavies as well, segment, at least this 1/3 within a cavalry unit of that kind. The Chinese are pretty nasty in here because they do not want to admit like the Korean forces have good cavalry, right? They stress specifically the fact that the Korean defeats are due to some sort of relevant lack of heavy cavalrymen. And this is perhaps just a topos, saying these are barbarians basically. So overall they are weaker, they are softer, or at least they're more lightly equipped, right? And so yes, they actually do have heavy cavalry, but overall it's not so, like, they don't have this critical mass to put together like the Chinese imperial armies could on a much larger basis. So this may be the idea. It's not much a matter of composition, but a matter of cohesion, right, and collective training as always. So I guess that's a suitable interpretation of what these Chinese sources are actually talking about. In any case, it's evident that the Koreans had pretty heavy cavalry on their own as the normal elite of a medieval army. We have a particular and likely guard unit known as Meisang that is described and distinguished exclusively by the fact that apparently the shield patterns used by these troops depicted strange beasts. I made multiple videos on shield patterns throughout history, and I can think of the beautiful medieval Korean art depicting chimeras, for example, that are something you find on the Bayeux tapestry as well. They were the symbol of the transfiguring warrior, right, from the chthonic to the Uranian dimension. We will see now some iconographic sources that come from broader sets of frescoes depicting all these various figures. By the way, I can't think exactly here what the Chinese were meaning by that, because actually the Korean and Chinese animal symbolism are fairly similar, but this is not necessarily what what concerns us here. It's this view, really, that we have to content ourselves with. We know, broadly speaking, under the Mongolian rule, that the Korean forces summoned for broader international expeditions were mostly made up of infantry, of the heavy and say the heavily and lightly armored type. Let's put it this way. Of course, there were lighter troops. There was cavalry, but as we've seen for the Chinese, let's say from ancient times in general, it was more likely for numerically for Koreans to send these lighter troops that at some point were maybe just even an imposition, like an attempt to, for example, I don't know, destroy the Korean agricultural production by levying these troops that would be employed in different ways. The Korean peasant could be mildly militarized to some extent. All these guys floating around from the steppes and from, say, powers that want to harass you. There are open spaces. There are there is a fortified dimension, as we've seen. So, generally speaking, these communities are able to put up a fight with some decency. Depends also, however, which kind of roles were employed, how they were trained, how they were equipped, how they were generally prepared against which enemies, by the way. So when we look at, for example, the Mongolian waves or armies sent against Japan twice, we find respectively 6, 5, and 10,000 Koreans in them. And again, a very few of these people actually come back home alive. We have to think at that point that most of these auxiliary forces were framed within the Mongol, not just under Mongol organization, but probably Mongol units, right? As auxiliary forces of some higher type of trooper. They were probably retrained to some extent, armed in probably also in slightly different ways, even though mostly they would fight with their traditional gear. So, speaking of tactics, unfortunately, we have to be humble and realize that in the absence of more detailed battle descriptions, we actually do not know much about how the Koreans, for example, arrayed themselves into battle. We understand that cavalry was probably like in the front, right? We have evidence of infantry forming the center at different times, but we do not know how exactly the other arms were integrated. Missile troops were likely present on the flanks and the rear. Surely there was some cavalry unit serving as mobile reserve here and there, but these are just generic principles. The interesting would be to know what was especially the role of cavalry, which I believe just by instinct here, I haven't seen it very often, like being of course decisive and in the front. Alright, but something more articulated is likely. For example, in that video I described to you about the Liao, the Kitai warfare. Well, we've seen an incredible complexity, sort of hybrid between Mongol and Chinese warfare, with pretty effective infantry to a great extent, capable of outflanking the enemy, supporting cavalry at close ranges. Here probably it's similar, even though we've seen there is an important role played properly by lighter cavalry next to and missile troops rather than heavy infantry next to the Korean feudal cavalry, like the heavy retinue. And this sort of makes sense, even though we should have really been there to find out, but I'm getting curious myself about this specifically, so I may make other videos about this. Surely it was nothing overly complicated. I mean, nothing really in warfare is, so just by comparing the sources between the Kitai, the Liao, and the Korean ones, like we should be able to grasp something. In any case, we can highlight a trend from ancient to medieval warfare in terms of probably the development of the estates that produce particular type of troops. So as we've seen before the 4th century BC, it seems that the Korean armies consisted mostly of an importantly large amount of infantry, and probably including skirmishers on foot, and cavalry was present, heavies were there, but in very small numbers, and the more prevalent type of cavalry being light, and overall the mounted arm being fairly small compared to infantry. There was not that much in general, but still, extremely primitive times and places, by the way. Then after this, let's say, between the 4th century BC and the 4th century AD, we find an increase in cavalry force. There is a strengthening of hierarchy, a stratification of society. You definitely see more consistent combination of heavy cavalry, larger amount of light horsemen, plus some sort of diversification even in the infantry, more armor and more specialization, also in more refined missile forces, for example. From the 4th century AD to, say, the 13th, it is clear that this trend has increased. We find these beautiful cataphracts we will be illustrating in a while, an important light cavalry in the guise of horse archers, mostly an armored crossbowman on foot, but we should be thinking there were some mounted crossbowmen as well. This was, after all, not rare in spite of some inexplicable things you read here and there on some disclosure texts, also in Europe. But most of, at least numerically, most of the army was made up of infantry and including, again, armored, but mostly lightly armored, and also light infantry in general. So still archers, but having perhaps an increasing specialization of the crossbowman tendency, as it was happening, in Eurasia, especially flanking cavalry in an anti-cavalry function to properly, in fact, outflank the enemy one in frontal clashes. Then for the Mongol period, we see better how cataphracts are an ultra elite of some sort, and then there is some heavily armored cavalry, still the light, the horse archers. We see some guardsmen better outlined. This must have existed in an important way since the beginning, of course, of the Korean monarchy. But at this point, probably the fact we see them better corresponds to an increased stratification. After all, Korea is pretty feudalized, at least in its own Far East Asian way, and the Mongol invasions produce a similar impact, the one you see in Eastern Europe, for example. They raze a lot of places to the ground. This favors dramatically the aristocracy that takes even more over, like the peasant communities are completely broken, and so what you see is an increased professionalization and elitization, let's say, of warfare, with the peasantry basically cut out of the military business in many ways, so that in fact probably the amount of infantry starts decreasing, and it's probably also worse equipped in absolute terms. In relative terms, it would be better troops that are like soldiers paid by these powerful oligarchs, but it's not about the masses, and also combined arms that likely had been developing up to that point. This is the peak of it in medieval times. So something you can easily compare with Europe to some extent. You have to understand it just in the Korean source that is not immediately in our reach as Westerners, but even because of the sources that are sort of scanning. And as far as the contingents levied by the Mongols, a mass of poorly equipped, poorly trained forces, Yet, given that still there was a minimal cooptation of the Korean elite, still maybe some, bulk of very contained, but still very high, actually, in quality troops of some sort, mostly armored cavalry and infantry, constituting a small part of these forces. Overall, not too small, maybe even up to 1/3 or so, but surely separating itself from the mass. Without mentioning that it's likely that Koreans at this point began to field a larger amount of horse archers, quite light ones, that were not necessarily an injection from the steppes during the Mongol era, but rather the Mongolization of Korean warfare to some extent. And so all this, think about all the destructions that the country had undergone. As we've seen, the civilians had suffered terribly, and we see in moments of crisis, of destructuration, lots of peasants that were quite, again, say, habituated to work under the feudal elite, so quite say mandatorily peaceful to some extent and disarmed, etc., that however say screw this and began to become brigands and starting how to raid and plunder, etc., and they would start to do it the Mongol way, given that was the shockingly major influence that now pretty much almost all of Eurasia was receiving in its own kind of warfare, especially the areas that had been destroyed, had been occupied, right, subjugated, conquered by the Mongols, right. And the fact that Korea remains still, of course, a decentralized area from China overall, and that there are all these rebellions under the Yuans, it's still, favoring some further sort of a question raiding guerrilla warfare of some sort. So passing to some typically ideal Korean unit types, I condensate this all in one video. When otherwise, if this had been in Europe or somewhere closer, I would go in tremendous greater detail, would make, as a video for each of them. But again, I want to be complete when talking about countries like these, because I will not come back too often on them, and so I want to condensate and provide with this overall view that we know, by the way, so it's a good chance to take. The migration era Korean horsemen, right? Typically it's sort of medium cavalry type. There is a beautiful fresco in Manchuria dating to the Goguryeo dynasty, showing like the pretty average horseman whose sleeves are rolled up, right? He has a off-white with a black trim uniform, black cap, as much as the feathers. We can only speculate on the deeper meaning of all these colors and symbols. Of course, the contrast between black and white is, of course, quite powerful in a universal sense. We have another source from 894 AD, in which feathers were white and crimson, and interestingly enough, these were issued specifically, so there was some uniformity and recognition necessity, especially in a mounted warfare. This is cool, right? Because at least in the useful range in which you engage these guys, like a feather can help in that kind of recognition. Remember, again, the steps are pretty close, so everything is that more equestrian. The symbols matter in a deeper sort of anthropological way. These are horsemen coming from like some sort of deep aristocratic not in this case aristocratic, meaning that these are not elite cavalrymen, but they come from even essentially a tribal background. I hope many of these guys actually had steppes ancestry and more. We see overall some crude equipment. The bow seat is carried on the right side. We do not see any sword or shield, at least in the painting, but we can imagine at least a type of side weapon, especially for even if you're talking about the completely sort of naked horse archer, at least a knife, right, to scalp, to skin, to cut. That would be really typical. If we were to talk about Korean cavalry officer during the migration era, we can take as a stereotype the grey stoneware vessel from the tomb of the Golden Bell in Gyeongju, belonging to the Old Silla period. We are essentially 5th, 6th century. Then we can think of the average villain, right, of a Korean infantryman of sort without too much of a heavy gear. The bulk of the Korean army numerically, as we said, some of these troops would be even without a shield. Swords were a rare commodity of some sort. The material wealth of Korea was actually pretty scarce, especially at this point in history. The migration era was pretty hard time materially for everybody involved. This would make, as we've seen, Korean infantry in general like pretty vulnerable force that wouldn't withstand the shock cavalry tactics that were developing together with the aristocratic dominance on the peasantry. So these were essentially just some levies summoned every once in a while just to support the mounted troops and hoping just to go back home as soon as possible. Needless to say, these had also a lower experience. They had a scarce range of employment. I mean, the best efforts of the Koreans were to bring these troops even hundreds of kilometers away on campaign, but it was pretty complicated, and it was mostly cavalry that toured around just by their lifestyle, their fostering of different courts for training, for cooptation, and so on. The Tungkon frescoes show, interestingly, some uniform colors of sort, the black trim or red-brown, one with a tan trim as well, which suggests the possibility, of course, some of these troops were issued with a standard equipment of sort of certain recognition badges, like in this case, which speaks for still the affluence of some of this infantry. At least, they would have not overspent just for dyeing their clothing, but it was still speaking of a cooperation with their lords, right? And so after all, the necessary cavalry infantry cooperation in warfare just to be effective, these were not all throwaway units after all. The most beautiful source that I inserted here as well iconographically comes from the fresco, one of the figures at least of the depicted in the twin pillar tomb in the South Pyongan province. This dates to the Koguryo period. We're talking again pretty much like the migration era. The Chinese writing about the alleged lack of heavy cavalry among the Koreans, of course, would have had something to say about that fresco for sure. This work of art depicting a beautiful, as fully armored cataphract upon a fully armored horse. Right, this is a hell of a powerhouse, and as we've seen, actually during the same period, the Koreans were more than capable of carrying out successful cavalry charges against the Tang dynasty's infantry that weren't, as we've seen also with the support of combined arms, missile weapon, the last of the infantries in the world in that period. And of course, figures like these incarnate properly the traumatically violent feudal nature of the Korean mindset. You would have not wanted to be into these guys' heads and what they were capable of achieving in this world, what their lifestyle really was as the ultra elite. This also highlights the Korean capacities of fielding all an apparatus next to that. Again, the Chinese probably were right in saying that the Korean heavy cavalry was not as compact or cohesive, quantitative, and collectively trained as a match for the broader Chinese forces were, at least in general. But definitely such heavy knights show us all a society that is revolving around them. So the fact that we're represented, that we have also archaeological evidence, of course, of important horse accoutrement and more, definitely suggests that this cavalry was a structural feature of Korean warfare, in that it would remain there, in fact, as such for a long time. These guys were dressed in highly polished armor. They had red fabric trim ornaments. They had 3 to 3.6 meters long langs, which seemingly not even the Tang Chinese actually had, right? Which is interesting because, again, it suggests also a higher collective training in order to wield such weapon in a functional combat as well, and cavalry tactics. It's a bit like with infantry. The longer the spears, the greater the collective training in order to be effective. Here it's fairly long, at least for the Chinese. Surely the Chinese had something similar to that. It's just not as pronounced and documented mostly. But the sense still being that these guys were capable of both, of course, a grandiose individual capacities in combat, but also like individually, but also very well trained to fight numerously enough, at least as far as their strategical and operational needs were concerned. After all, Korea was subjected, as we've seen, to China, so they had limited capacities in the first place, strategically or logistically, but they surely had an important local cohesion that, at least especially in Korea with all those rebellions, was sort of highlighted. Surely troops like these would have been the norm among the guard units of the Korean monarchy. They sometimes probably were even too costly to be fielded. That could be a reason why the Chinese said such things. Again, you need enormous assets, like crippling ones, like if you don't have a robust society to sustain this, like to field them in the first place. So again, the prohibitive costs, like with the properly cataphract units at any time in history, were always an important consideration for every commander, but politically, for the cost that you had to exact from the broader community in order to field them rather than military. So that every lord would have this kind of panoply, but like putting together an army of lords would cost obviously more than the individual the sum of the single individuals, and that's the problem with politics and warfare and managing these armies, its logistics and more, and for how long can you field them, for example. This Korean nobleman must have been pretty difficult to control to a great extent for everybody involved, like the local monarch as much as the foreigners trying to rule over Korea. If we were to also sketch out a Korean infantry from the Mongol invasions of Japan, we can look at the famous Mongol invasion scrolls. There are beautiful Chinese drawings depicting what there are mostly these Sino-Mongol troops, but also some more savagely depicted troops that are, by historians of art, historians in general, identified as Korean auxiliaries of some sort. Right, and these are equipped in the Mongol fashion, which overall would have not been just a consequence of the Mongolian conquest, but also, again, because of the broader proximity to the steppes and to that, after all, pretty similar Northeast Asian military culture that was, in fact, that sort of permeably feudal in a way, and would accept elements from the steppes, etc. And so their gears would be similar, right? The average Mongol infantryman, we'll talk about them because they weren't just cavalrymen, would have looked pretty similar in the first place. So we're not even entirely sure that those are Koreans in the first place. There was also a sense that whoever fought on foot, of course, was a villain, some disgusting piece of trash, and so it's not that the Mongols cared very much whether this was a Mongol one or a Korean one, right? People today, I realize that they watch my videos because they think that they talk about the discriminantist nations, right? Those people's beliefs were exclusively based on the concept that if you were even from your own people but of a lower social status, you were racially inferior, right? And that was the most important divide. It was, better to find proximity with a foreign nobleman than with a lowly peasant scum, especially in cultures like these that were heavily equestrian, feudal, and so for which the peasants were truly just garbage, and they actually were in practice, given that, as we've seen, even from a tactical point of view, they weren't that performing in the first place. But we'll come back on this because I made multiple videos on Mongol warfare, but I'm not talking about infantry that much. I recently made a video about Seljuk infantry. That's very much sort of Western Eurasian vibe, but and it mostly focuses on the Sultanate of Rum. That was also the more kind of Western in kind. So infantry was more important, but we touch on some similar topic in here. And always remember that the steppes are not just cavalry, right? There are islands of sedentary peoples, and just the same horsemen can dismount and fight on foot, and this is the case also for the same Korean nobility. Again, not steppes, but they would spend their lives on horseback, literally, given that it was, again, the greatest reward of a nobiliary status in the first place that made them closer to God in the first place. There were at some point also surely better trained and equipped troops. For example, some spears could be fairly long, as much as the cavalry one, 3 meters and a half or even more, and this required an important amount of training. So of course, also within Korea there were some pikemen with some important cohesion. This is a very underestimated aspect. People tend to think that the pike came around the Renaissance, but it's not there. Aside from the fact that it was around since prehistory, it was an important component of medieval armies, like the actual discriminate, because people are dumb and think that it's technologism and determinism. You use the pike so you beat cavalry. No, there had always been pikemen. That's the only way you take down a cavalry charge. But if you're too weak and uncohesed and untrained and mentally weak, you're going to break, right? You can't form your pikes not square because there aren't enough men to do that until the Renaissance, that objectively, but it's about collective training. It's just the front ranks, right, of the troops that are like that, and then in the rear you have guys with blunt weapons or something that can take cavalry down. As we've seen, the Koreans do not have this tremendous infantry, but some of their troops would have been intensively trained to defend cavalry. It is by their same lords, their retinues. They weren't, again, excessive numbers, but plausibly in battle they would be arrayed all together, forming some compact mass that could help, say, forming a screen, even if, for example, the cavalry wanted to retreat behind it temporarily and similar things. Right? Again, from the Liao warfare, we learned that infantry was pretty dynamic in these in this context, in this Mongolian Chinese frontier. Right? And I'm saying it's valid for Korea. Some of these troops could be even equipped with multiple weapons, for example, spear and bow. This is fascinating. Some of these troops may have brought the spear from actual cavalry combat, as we've seen. It was the same length of cavalry, and so some auxiliary forces were saying before may have been part of those retinues, again picked ones, and they would maybe fight even on foot like that. Some had even a sword, so again you could find a well-equipped guy, but this was sort of less likely. We see wicker shields from the aforementioned Mongol invasion scroll. This defense is studded with arrows, which apparently haven't pierced the shield. Doesn't matter how thin it really appears. So the idea of having broad shields, very large ones, is something that against steppe tactics does really work to some important extent, because after all, arrows, yes, are powerful to some extent. They can even pierce shields depending on how they're made. But overall, the majority of the hits will be stopped by this shields. And given that these, arrows flew like hail everywhere, like having these larger shields is sort of the best way to defend yourself from that. You see, it's like in Eastern Europe. There are particular shield designs among the sedentary peoples that are larger because they have literally to cover more surface to stop this fire. It is not so tremendous as much as relentless. You see, a crossbow was something that would scare even a Mongol, and we know that. I made multiple videos on this topic. We constantly underestimate how superior Western warfare, after all, really was, aside from the major pitched battles like in Central and Eastern Europe showed. And in general, even with the performance of the composite bow, it depends on what distance you engage from, and which is, for example, shooting from horseback, your accuracy ambition, right? So it's not just about an absolute physical performance, it's also how were these weapons employed. And overall, you can imagine this infantry wanted just to protect themselves with sort of not overly expensive but still fairly encompassing covering shields. In the Mongol invasion scrolls, we do not find uniform colors, because plausibly the Koreans were just recognizable for being Koreans among the Chinese, the Mongols. We just see, however, some different color that was worn in a random sense, like blue, almost turquoise, emerald green, white, reddish brown, gray, buff, black. This could just stem from the particular art that is very beautiful, very colorful, very detailed as well. In Chinese art is really amazing in the 13th century, but say this Korean troops may have looked much more somber, right? And their clothing could have been just made even of skins of leather, something like that. So dark colors more than else. We're going to have to exclude, of course, a capacity of dyeing and even of supplying certain proto-uniforms of sort, especially depending on whom these guys depended. Because some were under their same Korean commanders, others were, as we've seen, probably seized by the Mongols. That sounds also quite terrifying for them. But again, the latter wouldn't care too much. The Mongols wouldn't care too much about what they thought, and they could easily distinguish them. And so, in that sense, they were more like field aides of some sort than troops you even needed to uniform in some way. Then, speaking of a Korean heavy cavalryman from the period, we do see some of these from the scrolls. At least we have to think that overall Chinese Mongol armor was pretty similar to the Korean one, and we can't confidently call it lamellar to some extent. There were different ways, some sort of tacits. We do not know that the composition exactly of the wall structure, but it is pretty much the typical Eurasian steppe one. Maybe the Koreans had a particular type of armor on their own. We do not know its name anyway. Just we see from this representation something maybe different structurally, but not systemically. Right? Maybe it's just this guy. Maybe it's not even Korean. I would call it just lamellar apparently, even though it's maybe something slightly different. The fact that in the scroll manuscript illumination the armor is colored in white, it means that it represents a polished metal of some sort. Always remember, I made a video about lamellar armor, and you know that you can have a certain type of design and then having any kind of material making it up. It can be metal, it can be bone, it can be leather, it can be whatever, right? This depends on the guy, how he came in possession of that armor in the first place. So these guys were the Korean aristocracy co-opted by the Mongols. More expandable than some of the Mongol one, so also trying to show off, hoping to gain some autonomy back home if they would come back there alive. Many of these guys still lay in the bottom sea of Japan. In any case, a trooper like that would be equipped with a 3 meters and a half or more length, a bow. However, shields are not seen, which at least by that degree of heavy armorness objectively is not much of a need. I mean, the Mongols would use small circular shields for their very heavy cavalry, or probably some none at all. Maybe here it's just a way of showing some auxiliary forces. So it's a conceptual choice more than a realistic one. Also in this case we do not find uniform colors, because these guys came from different clans' houses. They had a right to be different, right? Also up to the 18th century, Western officers could wear a bit whatever they wanted, in a sense. We see emerald green, white, buff, brown. So again, nothing to be surprised of. And speaking of the auxiliary infantrymen, as we were saying before, these were really weaker. But it's possible that some picked units coming together with the aristocratic forces really existed. We see some lamellar armor, for example, instead of the more habitual long robe among some of the soldiers. That would have been basically also the only armor the average Korean auxiliary would have worn. A small buckler would make for a shield, perhaps weaker in composition. Again, if you were wearing lamellar armor, okay, you perhaps don't need even that much of extra protection. But of course, if you are an average soldier that has, especially to go at war against enemies that make substantial use of missile fire, you're not going to be terribly protected. So the feeling is that these guys were mostly field aides, not just of the Mongols, but of the same Korean aristocrats that brought some of these guys with them. Without mentioning that these troops could have been gathered from a bit everywhere, considering the movements. God knows, like even within China, how many different situations you could find individually. The bow, however, was an effective way to counter arrows as well. You would have 1.5 meter long spear, which would have done to the minimum of, again, hand-to-hand fighting, but evidently these guys were not to clash against heavy cavalry or even heavy infantry with a lance that was double their size. So actually they would preferably accompany the heavies, mostly with their missile capacity. They could have had swords after all, especially if they were a bit of this brigand style. There were people who just lived for their masters and they made this for a living, so sooner or later they would have been rewarded with some kind of armament as well. But you don't have to count on that as well. Maybe a side weapon was sort of like a knife or whatever was more habitual. Also in this case, no uniformity. What the art shows is white, green, brown, and buffs. Yeah, kind of makes sense. At least would have been more likely something darker or somber. You would find some kind of NCOs of sort, even among the auxiliaries. For example, there are some musicians represented in these iconographic sources. Bass drums were quite common. Let's say that especially Eastern armies in general had greater need of musical coordination for reasons that now I can't quite digress on, but it's basically connected with the idea that you have many more sort of jumping around troops in the guise of horse archers that need to be addressed in more complex ways, because they are, let's say, faster in the first place, but they're also many. And so with sedentary armies you don't have all this great problem. Actually, even the extent of the importance of military music is in the West is underrated. People tell you, well, it's basically like the West didn't have much of that before at least the Ottomans arrived. The contemporary musical military bands, instruments are derived from them. Well, just study, I don't know, what in 13th century Germany armies were arrayed like, and you'll see how many musical instruments there were and how much we have completely skipped this awareness. Like, this is pretty notorious, even in just to anyone who has cursorily studied, say, medieval sources, like from the 13th to 14th century, at least. Korean standard bearers, right? What would they look like? Well, we have an interesting evidence, for example, of a orange fielded standard, the upper part of the Yin-Yang symbol in buff and the other part in white. And so something pretty colorful, pretty conceptual as far as the symbols go, and there would be many. Here's just an example, but it can give you an idea of what, like, these guys also spiritual vision of warfare really was. And so all things that we hopefully are going to come back on soon. This was a bit like the general picture. There isn't an overwhelming much to say more for this, again, brief presentation of the entire Korean warfare, this level of, of approximation. But again, these videos count as bases, layers for further work, and so they're very useful. I hope, at least they were for me. They are for me, and I hope that you enjoyed them. Of course, as much as you can pair them with the other videos I made that I usually put like in evidence in the top fixed comments that have to do with that, with Chinese warfare. We've seen recently Vietnamese warfare, we've seen Laos war. We're going to expand, but Mongol warfare as well. So we're going to cover roughly all of Asia, even though the channel's focus is on Europe. And this is pretty much it. Again, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.